So, welcome to the Self Learning Platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 15, Karl Marx. And our topic is Theory of Surplus Value. Another key feature of class relations in capitalism, according to Marx, is the expropriation of surplus value by the bourgeoisie from the labor of the proletariat. The theory of surplus value is discussed by Marx in general detail in his Capital. The theory of surplus value is rooted in the labor theory of value propounded by Ricardo and classical economists. The labor theory of value holds that labor spent by the laborer in the production of a commodity is the sole criteria for determining its value. Of course, it will also depend on the use value of that commodity. Marx admits that human labor cannot create value by itself alone. It uses instruments of production which are owned by the capitalist. The capitalist buys the labor power of the laborer and applies it to the new raw material to produce commodities which have an exchange value. The difference between the exchange value of the commodity and the wages paid to the worker by the capitalist in producing that commodity is surplus value. In fact, Marx explains the whole process of exploitation with the help of his theory of surplus value. It is a distinct feature of capitalist mode of production. To put it in the simple words, surplus value occurs because the commodity produced by the worker is sold by the capitalist for more than what he receives as wages. In his Capital, Marx elaborated it in a very technical language. He argued that the worker produces a commodity which belongs to the capitalist and whose value is realized by the capitalist in the form of price. The value of the commodity depends on the capital involved in its production. This capital has two parts: constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital relates to means of production like raw material, machinery, tools, etc., used for commodity production. The variable capital refers to the wages paid to the worker. It is the value of what the laborer sells. Surplus value is the difference between the value produced by the worker and what he gets in exchange for this value of his labor. This is called variable capital because it varies from beginning to end. It begins as value of the labor power and ends as the value produced by that labor power in which form of the commodity. Labor power has thus a unique quality of its ability to create value. Marx argued that the capitalist appropriates a part of the labor of the worker for which he does not get paid. Thus, surplus value is unpaid labor of the laborer. It can be variously measured in terms of time as well as in terms of money. Suppose a worker works for 10 hours and producing a commodity. He may get paid for only what is equivalent to his 8-hour labor. Thus, his 2-hour labor has been appropriated by the capitalist. Marx also argued that gradually the proportion of surplus value becomes more and more. In the example cited above, the worker was not paid for his 2-hour labor out of 10 hours that he had spent in producing a commodity, because he was paid only for his 8-hour labors. By and by, the proportion of unpaid labor will increase from 2 to 3, 4, or 5 hours. Finally, a stage comes when the worker gets paid only the minimum that is necessary for his survival. His survival does not mean only his personal survival, but also the survival of his family, so that when this worker is not able to work due to old age or death or ill, his children may take his place. As pointed out above, the working class consists of those who own nothing but their own labor power, which they are forced to sell in order to live. According to Marx, the history of capitalist production is a history of struggles by the capitalist to increase his surplus value and resistance by the workers against this increase. There is a difference in the way in which the surplus value was created in the slave society and under feudalism and the way it is created in the capitalist society. In the former, the slave or the serf who created surplus value was tied to his master or the feudal lord, but in capitalism there is a free contract into which the worker voluntarily enters with the capitalist. Of course, this freedom is a myth because the worker has no option but to sell his labor power. He must enter into contract with some capitalist. The only option that he has is to choose the capitalist to whom he wants to sell his labor power. Thus, this freedom is freedom to choose his exploiter. The slave and the serf did not have this freedom. Next is the theory of revolution. The basic cause of revolution, according to Marx, is the disjunction that arises between relations of production and the means of production. As means of production or technology, etc., grow with growth of scientific knowledge, they go out of step with the existing relations of production. A stage is reached where the relations of production becomes a fetter on the production process itself. This gives rise to imminent demand for a transition to a new mode of production. The capitalist mode of production emerged from the womb of feudal order in the same way as the feudal mode of production emerged from the womb of the slave society. Likewise, socialism will emerge from the womb of bourgeois society itself. This is so because capitalism constantly revolutionizes its own means of production and thus undermines its own conditions of existence. In fact, The bourgeoisie produces, above all, its own grave diggers. Marx asserted that the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but class antagonism arising from the social conditions of life of the individuals. Thus, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create material conditions for the resolution of that antagonism. Marx's assertion that the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of social process of production is rooted in the assumption that all the previous historical movements were movements of minorities in the interest of minorities. The proletariat revolution will be different from them. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of capitalist society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself to the position of ruling class without the whole superincumbent strata of the officials being sprung into the air. Along with it, Marx also spelled out the method which will be followed by the proletariat class to achieve its objective. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels declared that communists scorn to hide their views and aims. They openly declare that their purpose can only be achieved by forcibly overthrow of the whole capitalist order. Thus, the emancipation of the proletariat is predicted by Marx on the emancipation of humanity. Here it is important for you to bear in mind that in the history of revolutions, there is a debate about the role of subjective or human and objective or material factors in making a revolution. Whether it is the mere existence of a proletariat class which will bring about the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, or is it the consciousness of this proletariat which is necessary for doing so? Marx's position in this regard is very significant. He sees a dialectical relationship between philosophy's comprehension of the world and its ability to change it. Theory must evolve a proper interpretation of the world before it is able to change it. The ultimate task of philosophy is not merely to comprehend reality, but also to change it. Parasites revolutionizes the existing reality through human action. Revolutionary praxis has therefore a dialectical aspect. Objectively, it is the organization of the conditions leading to ultimate human emancipation, and subjectively, it is the self-change that proletariat achieves by its self-discovery through organization. Thus, the dilemma of determinism versus voluntarism is transcended by Marx through the dialectical nature of revolutionary consciousness. Objective conditions themselves will not bring about the revolution until and unless the proletariat grasps the fact that by shaping its own view of the world, it also changes it. If revolutionary consciousness exists, then revolution is bound to occur. When the worker comprehends that under capitalist production he is degraded to the status of a mere object, a commodity, he ceases to be a commodity, an object, and becomes a subject or active agent. This is revolutionary consciousness. The understanding of the existing reality by proletariat is, therefore, a necessary condition for the possibility of revolutionizing it. In other words, it is only an understanding of the internal dynamics of capitalism by the proletariat that will enable it to make revolution, which will signal the transition from capitalism to socialism. Next is dictatorship of a proletariat. Dictatorship of the proletariat is another important concept of Marx's writings. Marx did not write very clearly and systematically about the dictatorship of the proletariat and about the abject nature and form of post-revolutionary communist society. At best, his treatment is sketchy. In a letter to Vandermeer, Marx said that he had not discovered the concept of classes and class struggles. What I did that was new was to prove, first, that the existence of classes is only bound up with the particular phases in the development of production. Second, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And third, that this dictatorship of the proletariat itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes, leading to the establishment of the classless society. Thus, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a necessary intermediate point or a transitional phase on the path from capitalism to socialism and communalism. In the critique of the Goa program, he further clarified that between capitalism and communist society lies a period of revolutionary transformation from one that is capitalism to other that is socialism. In political sphere, this transformation will take the form of dictatorship of the proletariat. It is the first step in the revolution of the working class, which will raise the proletariat to the position of a ruling class. In Marx's view, during the dictatorship of the proletariat, there will be a regime in which the proletariat will control the state power. Such a transitional phase of dictatorship of the proletariat is necessary because the destruction of whole capitalist social and political order cannot be fully achieved without capturing the state power and without using it as an instrument to create conditions for the ushering in of a communist social order. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.